Welcome to another edition of Morgantown Memories. I'm Harold Swifty Shaver. Today we are welcoming Albert Rod Everly to speak about the WVU co-ed murders. Hello.
I'm glad to be here.
Tell us how you got interested in this case.
Back in 1970, I was a member of the West Virginia National Guard, and there was a murder committed in Morgantown called the West Virginia co-ed murders, where two college girls were hitchhiking and were picked up downtown on University Avenue and taken out to an area in the Weirton Mine area where they were probably decapitated at that location. While I was in the National Guard, we were called out to search for the co-eds in 1970, and on April 14th, we started our search of the Weirton Mine area. The first day, we searched on the Grafton Road and went down to the Goshen Road and then proceeded down the Goshen Road to the Weirton Mine. At that time, we went and inspected all the tunnels and mine shafts and looking for the missing bodies. Then on the 15th, we proceeded up what's called Owl Creek Road and searched that area. And then on the 16th of April, we went up Owl Creek Road and found the missing co-eds at that point. My background is in drafting and engineering. I have an extensive background in mathematics and taught drafting in 1970 at the area vocational school and taught there 12 years, teaching basic drafting and blueprint reading. I was also a member of the 201st Artillery Unit of the West Virginia National Guard, where I was a sergeant at that time. My other background is in construction and construction management. I did a lot of million-dollar projects where I designed them and built them. And during those projects, I had to research building codes, zoning regulations, and learn to read in minute detail the codes, use them the way that would benefit the client that I had. So the experience in that paid a lot of dividends when I started researching this co-ed case. A year ago in November, I went to a book signing of the West Virginia University co-ed murder case, a book written by Jeff and Sarah McLaughlin. At the book signing, I asked them some questions in a discussion with the writers, and one of the questions I asked them was, do they have copies of the 4 anonymous letters in the co-ed murder case? And Sarah informed me that she did, and I asked her to send me a copy of them because I had a hunch of how the case, the mileage in the case should have been figured out. And she sent me the 4 letters, and when I received the letters, the one question that I had was, where did they measure the 25 miles plus 1 mile in the woods from? And in the very first letter, it described the location down on University Avenue where the Welcome to Morgantown sign was located. And at that point, I knew where the bodies were located because we found them. And I took my car and set the trip indicator on 0 down on University Avenue at the city line. And I proceeded to drive south up the Grafton Road to the Goshen Road. And at that point, my trip indicator showed the mileage 5 miles exact. I turned right on the Goshen Road to get down to where the bodies were located and drove 2 miles down the road. Again, I stopped and looked out to the left, and there was the forest that was described in the letters I'd received. And then what I did, I drove on down the Goshen Road 4/10 of a mile, doubled back up Owl Creek Road 6/10 of a mile, and I was sitting in front of where the co-ed bodies had been found in 1970. It took me 2 days to figure out the mileage game that had been played by the anonymous letter writer. Well, it's been 53 years now that this case has not been solved. And when the book came out, that brought memories back of the time while I was leading the search team as to some of the thoughts I had in 1970. One was the fact that the mileage was so far off. The West Virginia State Police followed the information in the letters and drove 25 miles to south on the Grafton Road and ended up calling back to the command center and telling them they had driven the 25 miles and they were in the middle of Grafton and there was no woods in sight. So they proceeded on down the road another mile and found the woods and conducted a search in that area. They called back to the command center, and the command center had contacted the state trooper that was assigned to me and told him that they had gone to Grafton and the mileage was way off. So at that point, I thought the writer of the letters was playing a game with the West Virginia State Police, a game of cat and mouse, like a lot of serial killers back in the 70s did. The Zodiac Killer and Charlie Manson and some of those people. I took this challenge on to investigate this because I knew the facts were overlooked. The 4 letters that, the 4 anonymous letters that were sent from Cumberland, Maryland, told in great detail where the bodies and the heads were located. In 53 years, nobody figured out that those letters, they were overlooked. And those 4 letters was actually a confession from the letter writer that he knew where the bodies and the heads were in 1970. But nobody could figure it out because of the mileage, and some of the people thought that it was made up. So I wanted to get the facts out so that people could judge on the truth of what the facts are.
Well, you know, there's a lot of different theories and suspects, and I know you know other directions this could go. But of course, we're going to get into the letters, the 4 letters that were written and how the bodies were discovered in the first place. But before that, tell us about some of the other theories.
Well, there's a lot of theories, and there's been a lot of research trying to find somebody that they could tie to the case. In 53 years, they've not had any real solid evidence other than the 4 anonymous letters.
We need to get into the letter part of it now, and your particular theory on this person in Cumberland, Maryland.
The 4 anonymous letters had been sent to the West Virginia State Police in April 8th, 10th, 21st, and 25th of 1970. The 3 writers of the 4 letters were found by the West Virginia State Police in July 14th, 1970, in Cumberland, Maryland. They were the Reverend Robert Warren Hoover, who was a self-ordained minister of the psychic science religion in Cumberland, Maryland. And he claimed about 30 members of being in his cult. Reverend Hoover was a white male, 39, and Amanda Young, who was a white female, was 60, and Fred Channing, who was a white male, 75, all lived together in Lavelle, Maryland. Reverend Hoover graduated from high school and took a correspondence course from a school in Florida. And the course was psychic science. The course consisted of talking to dead people and persons from outer space. His only other work experience was a short time of working as an electrician. Reverend Hoover and the members all got their information from the spirit world. Reverend Hoover, Annabelle, and Fred also confessed to the Maryland State Police and also the West Virginia State Police that the three of them wrote the 4 anonymous letters and mailed them to the West Virginia State Police on the dates previous in 1970. Hoover also told the police and Associated Press that 2 members of his church had been involved in the murders. In the letters, he mentions the heads were used for other purposes. I don't know if that is sacrificed the heads to the spirit world or what purpose they had. As a personal opinion, I feel that the 2 co-eds were killed for their heads only. According to the autopsy report, the girls showed no signs of sexual activity, no trauma to the body, no drugs, alcohol, pot, cuts, or broken bones. The bodies were fully clothed, and except for 1 fur coat and a pair of fur boots, everything else was in place. The autopsy report also stated their time of death may have been 2 or 3 hours after having eaten, according to the coroner. The stomach of Mallory showed some yellow particles and ingestion of corn and beans. So the coroner placed the time of death within 3 hours of the time that they ate. The co-eds were picked up hitchhiking at 10:50 p.m. on the night of January 18th. If you round that off to 11 o'clock, and you say from 11 o'clock you go 3 hours, say they ate at 11 o'clock or at the movie, that would put them in time of death being around 2 o'clock in the morning. The West Virginia State Police had interviewed 3 different families. On the morning of January 19th, 3 different families had stated that they heard screams coming from the crime scene area the night before. The screams were around 2 or 3 o'clock a.m. The screams lasted less than 5 minutes. From that testimony of witnesses, it seems that the girls may have been killed right there where the bodies were found. There had also been reports of a car matching a description of the car that picked up the co-eds. The car was seen in the immediate area of the crime scene before the bodies were found. There was also a witness report of a pot party on the weekend, that weekend in the Wheaton Mine area. There was also a witness report from the roommate that said that her roommate had attended that pot party and that she had seen something that night that upset her terribly, and she wouldn't talk about it to anybody. And she shortly thereafter dropped out of school at West Virginia University. That's one lead that has not been followed up on. Go back and talk about the 3-month lull, the 88 days from January 18th, 1970 to April 16th, 1970. There were no leads, sightings, contact, or activity in the co-ed case, and no news releases from the newspaper or the media. At this time, April 8th, the Dominion News released information to the public that the purse of one of the girls had been found on the Grafton Road. Again, nobody knew where the bodies were except the killers. The very same day of the news release, an anonymous letter writer in Cumberland, Maryland, wrote his first anonymous letter. He wrote 4 more letters to follow in the next 17 days. That first letter was received the very next day by the West Virginia State Police, April 9th. At this time, the West Virginia National Guard was activated to help the West Virginia State Police in the search for Merritt and Karen. It was during this 90-day law that the anonymous letter writer and his killers decided to tell the police where the bodies and the heads of the West Virginia co-eds were located. Between January 18th and April 16th, Reverend Hoover had a seance with the spirit world. The spirit world gave him detailed information on the co-ed murders and the location of the bodies and the heads. Reverend Hoover claims that his seance was with the killers. He even taped the seance for future use. When the West Virginia State Police located him, he played the seance tape for them and even gave them a copy of the tape. We have checked both case files of the co-eds, and the tape's not anywhere to be found. On April 14th, the 201st Artillery Unit of the West Virginia National Guard was activated to help search for the missing co-eds. A team of guardsmen began searching the Halleck Road and miscellaneous back roads for personal items belonging to Karen and Merritt Mallory. The killers had done this to confuse the West Virginia State Police as to the exact location of the girls. The other team of about 15 guardsmen that I led worked with the West Virginia State Trooper Cunningham. The guardsmen were under the direct supervision of the West Virginia State Trooper Cunningham, who was receiving information and directions from the command center. The search began at the intersection of the Halleck Road and the Grafton Road. The West Virginia State Police Command relayed information from the first 2 letters, giving directions to Trooper Cunningham to search the Grafton Road, the Goshen Road, the Weirton Mine, and the Owl Creek Road. That information was shared with myself and my men. Trooper Cunningham and myself discussed the letters in great detail for the 3 weeks we worked together while we were looking for the bodies and the heads. Sergeant Everly, myself, had a gut feeling that the writer was playing games with the mileage, and he thought some combination of the numbers would tell the exact location of the bodies. Only one problem: I didn't know where they had measured from in 1970 for the 25 miles. The team of guardsmen searched the Goshen Road and the Weirton Mine complex with no results on April 15th. On April 16th, myself and Trooper Cunningham began the search of Owl Creek Road. About 6/10 of a mile up Owl Creek Road, I sent my team up an old mine road next to the creek to a strip mine. And TC and I were standing out on the Owl Creek Road when we heard screams from Steve Slavinsky, one of the guardsmen, yell for help. I raced to Steve's location, which was about 30 yards, where a girl's lower leg was protruding out from the brush pile. Trooper Cunningham had my team of National Guardsmen secure the area around 11 a.m. Everyone waited till around 3 p.m. for all the officials to come from around the state before the co-eds were uncovered. It was at this time it was noticed that the girls had been decapitated. Also, the girls were fully clothed, except one girl was missing her fur coat and one girl was missing her fur boots. Around 5 p.m., a team of National Guardsmen carried the bodies from the location. The missing co-eds had been found deceased. On April 17th, the West Virginia National Guard continued to search in and around the Weirton Mine area for the heads with no results. Also on April 17th, Trooper Cunningham informed me that the night before, April 16th, he was assigned the task of taking the parents of the co-eds to the West Virginia morgue to identify the bodies of the co-eds. He became choked up when he told me that it looked as though the killer had practiced chopping on that first girl. He also said the second girl was a clean cut. Why has this perfect murder never been solved? He said no one believed the mileage, 25 miles plus 1 mile in the forest. No one believed the letters were real. Everyone believed the letters were made up. The letter writer made the letters and mileage too complicated for anyone to figure out at that time. The anonymous letter writer was playing a game of hide and seek with the police to find the bodies and the heads. People in 1970 didn't believe in psychics or seances. The anonymous letter writer gave names of 2 men he claimed killed the co-eds. Both names were listed as living in Morgantown, and one of them was from New Jersey. The West Virginia State Police checked those names, and both names were fictitious, and both addresses were fictitious. Reverend Warren Hoover was stated that he was too feminine to have killed the co-eds. The Maryland State Police felt Reverend Hoover was a crank because of the Pujo case that Hoover had sent information to, the same as the co-ed case, and the information was of little to no help. The West Virginia State Police also felt Reverend Hoover was a crank. The bodies were found too soon, in my opinion, because the cat and mouse game didn't play out long enough for the police to solve. The location of the heads has never been found in 53 years. People thought the letters came from the news articles. The only real leads in the case came from the 4 anonymous letters. January 18th, 1970, the girls were kidnapped in downtown Morgantown. Until April 16th, 1970, there was no activity in the case. Only the killers knew where the bodies were located. On March 1st, the purse was found on Route 119 South, which is the Grafton Road, and that purse was turned over to the Morgantown Police Department to take care of the evidence. It was stored there for 1 month. April 1st, the state trooper, Trooper Goodwin, stopped in the Morgantown Police Department to talk to a detective and saw this purse sitting on top of a filing cabinet. And he asked the detective where the purse came from. And the detective said he found it out on the Grafton Road. At that point, the state police began assembling a search party for out on the Halleck Road and the Grafton Road. On April 4th, the West Virginia Air National Guard had a search by air of the Halleck and Weirton Mine area. On April 6th, the West Virginia National Guard was activated. On April 8th, this was, the Dominion Post published that the purse was found. Also, on April 8th, the first anonymous letter was written in Cumberland, Maryland. And in that first letter, it stated twice exactly where the bodies were located. On April 9th, the first letter was received by the West Virginia State Police. Again, on April 10th, a second anonymous letter was written in Cumberland, Maryland. April 11th, that letter was received by the West Virginia State Police. April 13th, pill bottle, compact, glasses, pen, different items were recovered out on the Halleck Road by the National Guard. On April 14th, the first day that the National Guard began a foot search. On April 15th, my guard unit searched the Grafton Road, the Goshen Road, and the Weirton Mine. That was also the day that the police drove to Grafton. On April 16th, the bodies were found on Owl Creek Road. April 16th, driver's license was found on the Grafton Road. April 21st, third anonymous letter written telling about where the heads were located. 22nd, West Virginia State Police received that. 4 days later, April 25th, the fourth anonymous letter was sent to Dr. Malarick, married Malarick's father. On April 26th, fourth letter was received by the West Virginia State Police. July 14th, Lieutenant C.C. West, the West Virginia State Police and handwriting expert, had gone to Cumberland, Maryland, and met with Lieutenant Conrad of the Maryland State Police and found the writer of the 4 anonymous letters in Cumberland, Maryland, strictly by accident. July 17th, 1970, West Virginia State Police troopers Rogers and Goodwin, along with Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Edgar Highschool, traveled to Lavelle, Maryland to interview the 3 letter writers, Warren Hoover, Annabelle Young, and Fred Shannon. On April 8th, the first letter is received by the West Virginia State Police. Letter number 1, the location of the bodies. I have information on the whereabouts of the bodies of Maren Malarick and Karen Farrell. Follow the directions very carefully. To the nth degree, you cannot fail to find them. Proceed 25 miles directly south from the southern line of Morgantown. Enter into the forest exactly 1 mile. There are the bodies. 25 miles plus 1 mile in the forest. If you add the numbers left to right, you get 2 plus 5 plus 1 equals 8 miles to the bodies with no turns. That's straight to the bodies. The letter writer used 3 different combinations of the number 8 to fool everyone. 2 plus 5 plus 1, 5 plus 2 plus 1, and 2 plus 6 equals 8 miles to the bodies. At the bottom of letter 1, the writer said 25 plus 1 equals 26 miles total. If you take the 2 and add the 5 plus 1, that also equals 8 miles exact to the bodies. You'll see this number again in letter 4. There are 6 different combinations of the number 8. The writer chose 2, 5, and 1, and also 5, 2, and 1, and also 26, 2, and 6. The 6 different combinations are 2, 5, 1, 5, 1, 2, 5, 2, 1, 1, 2, 5, 1, 5, 2, and 2, 1, 5. All those combinations add up to 8. So out of that, he picked 2, 5, 1 to make the mileage so that the police couldn't break the code on where the bodies were located. In the 4 letters, he told everyone 6 times the exact location of the bodies, 2 times the exact location where the heads were located. Will reveal myself when the bodies are located. Sincerely, Triangle. We'll skip to letter 4 because it also had a place in there where he became upset with the state police and just in his mind just threw out the exact location to where the bodies were. He says all of a sudden the police have been complaining about an error in the mileage in my second letter. After one is driven in an oval pattern 26 miles under the weather conditions of January, it is possible to make an 18-mile error in the precise location of the bodies. First thing I did, I broke 26 miles down, and I questioned why 18 miles. And then the more I thought about it, I subtracted the 18 miles from the 26, and what did I get? 8 miles exactly to the bodies. If you take the 8 miles to the bodies and add it to the 18, you got the 26 miles total that he had in the very first letter. I questioned the 18-mile error. So I got in the car, and I decided all the evidence was distributed up on the Halleck Road, the Grafton Road, and some of the back roads. So I thought, well, see how far it is to drive from the bodies around and come back to the bodies. So I started with 0. I went back down Owl Creek Road to the Goshen Road, with 0.6 of a mile. I went 0.2 of a mile over to the Mine Road. That meant that's where the location of the heads was at. Drove on out to 73 south of Fairmont Road. That was 1.8 miles from the bodies. Drove up to Tom's Run Road, which is a shortcut up to the Halleck Road. And it was 2.2 miles to Tom's Run Road. Drove up to Tom's Run to the Halleck Road. It was 3.8 miles from the bodies. Drove out the Halleck Road to the Grafton Road. It was exactly 10 miles. I drove down to the Goshen Road. That was exactly 15 miles. Went 2 miles down the Goshen Road, plus 1 mile in the woods. I'm sitting in front of the bodies. It was exactly 18 miles. You add the 8 miles on there that he drove from the bodies to the city line. You add that 8, now you have the 26 miles total. Showed a copy of the original letter from Reverend Hoover. And in that original letter, you'll see down at the bottom left-hand corner, he drew a map. Shows the city of Morgantown in a black dot. And it shows a line, which was the southern limit of the city of Morgantown. He drew a line straight down the page. And on the left-hand side, he says, follow this line. You come to another line, and he has a note on the right side that says, edge of the woodland. And down at the bottom, he has a dot. That's where the bodies are. So on the right-hand side, he put a dimension line, 25 miles. So if you take the 25 and you put 2 plus 5, now you got 7 out in the column, and you add the 1 mile in the woods, you've got 8. So in this map, he shows you that the bodies are exactly 8 miles from the city line of Morgantown. In letter 2, he says, reread my first letter. Remember, this is 2 days after the first letter. He says, if you reread my first letter carefully, you will see the directions were specific. You go directly south from the city, meaning the southern limit of Morgantown. Straight south 25 miles, you will come to a forest woodland. Enter in 1 mile. And he had south in parentheses. Put the compass right there where you enter the forest. And if you go on down the Goshen Road, you go directly south. He says, fanning out, you will locate the bodies of the girls covered over with brush. Look carefully. The animals are now on the move. So he tells you specifically that they were covered with brush, which they were. They were laid on top of stones because the ground was frozen. The animals are now on the move. The one girl's leg had been pulled out of the brush pile, and the foot was eaten off of it, and one finger was missing. He says, do trust this will help you to the exact location. Will still identify myself when the bodies are located. Sincerely, Triangle. Some notes that I had were, the writer is upset the West Virginia State Police is not moving fast enough. The writer has been back to the bodies in the 88 days from January 18th to April 16th. The writer wants the bodies to be found as soon as possible because the animals had already gotten into the leg of one of the girls. The writer was watching us daily. Trooper Cunningham and I both felt that we were being watched. The writer wanted credit for finding the bodies. He made no bones about that. The writer knew who actually murdered the co-eds or murdered them himself. The writer knew the exact mileage, 8 miles to the bodies. And the writer also wanted the reward money of $3,500, which at that time was a good bit of money. In letter 3, the first 2 letters, he never mentioned the heads being missing. But in letter 3, he gives the coordinates to locate the heads. And he says, I'm sending along another clue. The heads can be found from the position of the bodies by striking out 10 degrees southwest for the first head and approximately 10 degrees southeast for the second, roughly 1 mile. You covered 7/10 of that mile already. They are within the mine entrance, if you can call it an entrance, considering its condition. They are buried not over 1 foot in depth. You take, in parentheses, you take 1 mile, already covered 7/10 of that mile, you have 3/10 of a mile left. Just keep that in mind. The ones responsible for the murders scattered some of the girls' personal effects over the general area, creating a pattern of confusion, making it difficult for you to pinpoint any exact locations. Don't give up now. I will still identify myself when your investigation is completed. He's telling them he's not going to reveal himself when the bodies are found, but now when they find the heads, then you've completed your assignment. It is exactly 1.1 mile from the bodies to the center of the old wreck gate, and 1/10 of a mile to the sump hole, which is 1.2 miles. I took my compass and placed it in the center of the gate to check the coordinates from letter 3, south 10 degrees west and approximately 10 degrees southeast for the other. There is a large settlement pond that is located in the area where the heads might possibly be. I contacted the owners of the property for permission. They referred me to a former engineer who had supervised the construction of the pond in the late 1980s. The engineer knew everything about the ground in 1987. He identified a broken down mine gate that was there when they began putting the pond in. He told me that they had torn the gate down and buried it along the creek. I asked him about the location of the road, and he said that's the original location, and I had a map from Geologic Survey that showed that road being there in 1957 and 1979. And that area that we were looking at was all flat, where they built the retention pond. The location of the sump hole, I had no idea where the sump hole was, nor the owner of the property. But he described the sump hole as a place where the road made a turn and people would dump trash there, brush and old tires and stuff like that. That's what is considered a sump hole. The ground around the pond, I asked him if they had excavated that when they built the sediment pond. And he said no, the owners wanted that left natural because they didn't want people to be able to see the sediment pond from the road. So that ground was all original ground. When we got ready to leave, he told me, he said, Rod, he said, this ground is all sand. And he said, I asked the owners if they wanted me to load the sand up and sell it to a concrete company. And they told him they didn't want to do that, leave it the way it was. So that ground in January 1970 was sand and real small pieces of gravel or rock. He told me that the sides of the pond were built out of clay, rock, and some sand. And the engineer located, came back out and located the original topsoil. When we excavated the first hole, the state police thought they had hit clay or slate, and I didn't see how that could be. So I had the engineer come back out, and he told me that that was the original topsoil. We had to dig down 2 feet to get to the original topsoil on our location number 1. The next thing was to locate cadaver dogs to go out and see if they could find anything. And I honestly didn't believe that I'd find anything at all. And I found a woman in Grafton that had access to 5 cadaver dogs. And they offered to come up and run them for nothing, just for the exercise. And the first dog they ran by itself hit a location on the side of the sediment pond and sat down and started barking. And probably about a half hour later, a dog over in the woods on the other side of the sediment pond sat down and started barking. It had hit a location number 2. So they ran the dogs and hit 5 more times, and then finally came back and ran 1 more time to make sure, and that made 6 times they hit on that 1 hole. At that time, I called the girls together and asked them, I said, well, what does this mean? What did we find? And they told me that they had found human scent, human remains. When we excavated, we may not find the heads. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, people may have come back. It's been 52 years. People may have come back and moved the heads, but the scent would still be there. And as it turned out, they were right. We didn't find the heads in that exact location, which was the exact location that the letters said the heads would be located at. I contacted the crime scene specialist of the West Virginia State Police, and Mike Keith came out and proceeded to bring the West Virginia State Police recovery unit, and they located the location according to the anonymous letters. The hole that we excavated was 5 foot by 7 foot, and we went down 2 feet, 8 inches, and didn't hit anything. And of course the letters said if we went down, the heads were only 1 foot deep. And of course I asked the question, is that the top of the head or the bottom of the head? And so we went on down 2 feet, 8 inches, and in the end, we dug all the way down till we hit solid rock in those 2 locations. We're still waiting on the state police to bring their laser X-ray type machine to check the area around the 2 holes themselves. The scent travels in the ground, in the air, in the water, so that the scent may have moved at sometime during that 53 years. And one person that lives out there said that that area had flooded a couple times back in the 70s. And the engineer said that the area where the retention pond was at one time must have been a river or a large stream. Okay, in letter number 4, the letter writer sent the letter to Dr. and Mrs. Mallory, the father and mother of one of the girls. He says, I've sent 3 letters to the West Virginia State Police. The first and second letters were taken with some seriousness. The search was successful in locating the bodies, minus the heads which were needed for other purposes. Don't let the authorities try to convey the idea the letters had nothing to do with finding the bodies. I did say I would identify myself when the bodies were found, but the police so far have left too many loose ends in their case. The third letter, which they have chosen to do little about, states as specifically as possible the location of the girls' heads, south 10 degrees west for one, and approximately 10 degrees southeast for the other, about 1 mile from the grave, just inside the wreck gate, buried 12 inches deep. The police had already covered 2/10 of that mile. If they go around the sump hole, they will miss the heads. The additional 3/10 of a mile must be measured across the sump hole. So in letter 3, the writer says they had covered 7/10 of that mile. In letter 3, you take the 1 mile, subtract 7/10. Remember, there was 3/10 of a mile left of that mile. In letter 4, the police had covered 2/10 of that mile. So that makes it 1.2 miles to the sump hole where the heads are located. We have a chart which shows the actual layout as to where the Owl Creek Road was, where the mine road that goes over to where the heads were located, and the actual description of the mileage. We have another map that I used to try to, in the beginning, try to locate where the heads might possibly be. And on that map, if you went 25 feet up the north-south line, the heads would have been 10 feet apart. If you went 65 feet up that line, they'd be 23 feet apart. And if you went 150, they would be 62 feet apart. I was trying to see approximately where the heads were located. I thought they would be just inside the gate. As it turns out, on the map, you'll see that hole number 1 was 305 feet from the gate. The sump hole was 375 feet from the gate, and hole number 2 was actually 120 feet from the center of the gate. And it was about 10 to 15 feet off the southeast line of 10 degrees. So it was, when I saw that, I was disappointed because like the first one fell right on the line. And the second was about 10 to 15 feet off. I went back and read the letter, and the letter said the second one was approximately 10 degrees southeast. So 10 feet, I take that as being approximate, and that's pretty close. We have another map which shows the exact location of just the location of the 2 holes, location of the sump hole, and the angles, and the creek, and the road. Now we have investigation report of Reverend Warren Hoover by the West Virginia State Police. A synopsis of the investigation of Robert Warren Hoover, male, 30 years old. After the investigation was complete, it was apparent that Warren Hoover was not the person who committed the murders, but he was the one who did send the letters. It was learned that Reverend Hoover does not have a driver's license or a vehicle, and no member of his family has a vehicle. subject travels with one Annabelle Young, a white female 60, who drives Reverend Hoover around and who is his apparent girlfriend. The investigation also revealed that Reverend Hoover is the leader of a self-ordained minister. For the past 10 years, he's been the head of that religious cult, known as the Psychic Science Religion. And he got his training through a correspondence course from Miami, Florida. That is his religion. And his belief is that he can talk to dead and persons from outer space. His following is mostly elderly people who lost loved ones. He holds meetings in Somerset and Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and near Cumberland, Maryland, and other unknown locations. He puts himself in a trance, and through his voice, he talks to the dead and the followers that are present, as if he was the loved one and not himself by being in this trance. The investigation found that Reverend Hoover wrote these letters for several reasons, some of which are he was interested in getting publicity from the news media for himself and his religion, that he will get in touch with the family of the murdered victims and through himself let the families talk to the victims and console their families. Reverend Hoover did give the names and addresses of the murderers to West Virginia State Police, giving their names, description, and addresses. At this point, it must be noted that upon receiving this report from Pennsylvania State Police, the West Virginia State Police ran a background check on the assumed murders and found that the two alleged murders were both fictitious and their addresses also. It is felt that Reverend Hoover, through his alleged ability, will attempt to obtain money from the families. It was also learned through this investigation that Reverend Hoover was not employed, and his income is from Social Security disability and from donations of money from his followers. It was also revealed that some of his followers signed their property over to him along with their money. The investigation revealed Reverend Hoover contacted the Maryland State Police in Cumberland, Maryland, when Stanley Haas escaped from the Pennsylvania jail in Pittsburgh. He killed a Verona policeman and later kidnapped the mother and daughter near Cumberland, Maryland. Reverend Hoover gave them information as to the location of the bodies and other details. The case was never solved, and it hasn't been solved to this day, as far as I know. The information Reverend Hoover gave the Maryland State Police was of no value to them. It was a general consensus of the West Virginia State Police and prosecuting attorney who went up and interviewed the three individuals. The three subjects had nothing whatsoever to do with the co-ed murders. The 25 miles south on I-119 South and 1 mile in the forest was totally inaccurate and made up. The subjects were living in a world of their own, and any attempt to discredit them would be met with hostility. They didn't believe the information in the letters came from the spirit world or in the seances. They compared the 4 letters with news articles in the Cumberland newspapers. A writer of the letters with a little imagination and some basic facts and some news articles might be able to write the anonymous letters. They didn't believe the spirit world or outer space could give the detailed description to the nth degree like the letters did. They did not believe the tapes were with deceased people. Dr. Spencer, the voice on the tapes, sounded just like Reverend Hoover. Both names and addresses of the 2 suspects were fictitious. They wished to receive the reward offered by the Malarick family, since Reverend Hoover, according to Mrs. Young, was instrumental in the finding of the bodies. The reward was $3,500. Nothing found that anyone gave large amounts of money to Reverend Hoover. The subjects had offered no information during the Puget kidnapping investigation, and what little information they did offer was inaccurate and only tended to support the fact that they were mere cranks, according to the Maryland State Police. It seems that the West Virginia State Police were the same opinion as the Maryland State Police, and that was that they were mere cranks also. The West Virginia State Police never considered Reverend Hoover a suspect and never took the anonymous letters seriously. They were sure the letters were made up. When the West Virginia State Troopers were working the co-ed case, were transferred around the state, the case became stagnant and no activity since. The West Virginia State Police on April 23rd, 1970, did a great job. They went to the West Virginia University Med School and got psychiatrists and psychologists, and also the assistant prosecuting attorney, and two of the lead investigators for the West Virginia State Police, and asked these individuals to analyze the 4 letters and give their opinion of who wrote the letters, so they'd have some idea who they were looking for. The comments were, the letters were written by someone between the ages of 20 and 25, not below 20, nor someone above 50. Has a fetish for certain types of apparel, like garments, fur coats, or fur boots. Might have a footwear fetish. Suspect might like to rub fur as the missing fur coat and fur boots. Suspect might like to wear the missing articles. Suspect may try to prevent identification, such as to remove the heads to hide the evidence or cause a death for other purposes. Suspect didn't bury him in the ground. Maybe he couldn't think of a better way. The ground was frozen in January, or maybe he was in a hurry. Suspect might like to return to the site from time to time to view his handiwork and get his kicks. Suspect lives in the area. Suspect probably committed lesser crimes before. Suspect is emotionally flat. He's good at blocking out feelings. The murder was committed by a cult, possibly a hippie cult like Charlie Manson. Ridicule could trigger further violent reactions. Suspect that wrote the anonymous letters is in his latter 20s. Suspect likes to play games. Suspect is likely to be energetic. Suspect has a great imagination and lives in a fantasy world. He's probably not married. He gets his kicks from using zodiac symbols. He is aloof and thinks he's important. He's probably not a college graduate. He has a superior attitude. He thinks he's very clever, but he is not. He gives very vague directions, but he thinks they're very specific and clear. He tells himself any trouble that the police have following his directions is because they are not smart enough. He might be a draftsman because of the drawing on the second letter and the coordinates for the location of the heads, or he thinks he has those skills. He probably fails with women. He is a frustrated man. He hates women, all of them. Trooper Goodwin asked the psychiatrist and the assistant prosecuting attorney, would you say the man who wrote these letters killed the co-eds? Undoubtedly, Dr. Carter says, while every one of the psychiatrists and psychologists around the table simply nodded in agreement. The consensus at the table is the same man who wrote the letters killed Meredith and Karen. But Trooper Goodwin's gut tells him otherwise.
Well, Rod, after all of this stuff that you've told us about the co-ed murders, who in your mind do you think is the prime suspect?
I think without a doubt that Reverend Hoover and Annabelle Young and Fred Channing committed the crimes or knew who did commit the crimes. I think that there's room to investigate those 3 people as being the murderers. Because if they didn't do it, they were guilty of being an accessory. They do know. Now, all 3 of them are deceased now. So somebody needs to go back and investigate them as suspects. Now, there was also 2 people in Morgantown that the state police, when they were all transferred, they were close to closing the case. They had 2 suspects that lived out on the Grafton Road. And a cold case retired state trooper in 2005 located one of them in a retirement home in Morgantown. Talked to that guy 3 times, and from the interviews, he sounded guilty as could be, but the state trooper died after the 3rd interview. So nobody really found out, but he sounded like he was guilty. I tied him to Cumberland, Maryland, and Hoover, because he left the summer right after the co-eds were found. He left and went to Cumberland, Maryland, and lived with the Amish for 25 years. Nobody ever talked to him. Nobody knew where he was at or what he did for 25 years until Trooper Hall found him at the nursing home. And his cousin left in January, right after the girls were kidnapped. He's the one that had the fur fetish, and he moved to Ohio, and they never interviewed him.
I want to thank you for coming in today, Rod, and sharing this information about the WVU co-ed murders.
Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.